Rabbi Baruch of Mezhibaj was the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. And it so happened that one of Rabbi Baruch's disciples decided to venture on his own, unprepared, into the realm of the esoteric, down the path of the Jewish mystical tradition. And he went so far down this path that he teetered on the edge of apostasy, of unbelief. When Rabbi Baruch learned what had become of his disciple, he was concerned, of course, but assumed that over the course of days the disciple would come to him to have his faith restored. But a week passed and the disciple had not returned. In fact, he had sequestered himself in his home. He had abandoned the synagogue and the Beit Midrash. He no longer studied Torah. He no longer prayed. And Rabbi Baruch knew that if he did not go and find this disciple and return him to his community, he might be lost forever. And so he found out where the disciple lived, and he went to his home, and without knocking on the door, he entered, and without waiting to be greeted, he spoke. And he said, "I know what you've done. You've set out on the path to find the answers to the deepest questions of faith. You've crossed through each of the first 49 gates, and at each gate you've asked a question, and without waiting for the answer, you've proceeded on to the next. And now you stand before the 50th and final gate, the gate that represents the greatest questions of all, and you are terrified of the answers." For the first time, Rabbi Baruch's disciple looked up and said, "You are right, but how can you possibly know?" And Rabbi Baruch replied, "Because I too have made the journey. I too have stood before that 50th gate, not knowing what lies behind it. But I'll tell you what lies behind it. Behind it is a yawning abyss. But beside that abyss, the deepest faith. You see, faith and the abyss always lie side by side. And now you must go through." "But I can't, I won't, I'm afraid," said the disciple. "I'd rather return to the first gate." "No, you mustn't," said Rabbi Baruch. "You've set out on the journey this far, and whether you feel prepared or not, you must go forward. You owe it to yourself. Let me take your hand, and we'll go through the door together." And so they did. A bit of background. According to the Jewish mystical tradition, one who seeks to draw close to God must pass through 50 metaphorical gates, each one a new level of faith. But the journey must be undertaken with patience and care, because each gate requires a step forward on which the next step depends. One who is unprepared or tentative can become paralyzed by uncertainty or tumble backwards. And yet, as Rabbi Baruch teaches, once we set out, we owe it to ourselves to see the journey through. This week's Torah portion resumes the narrative of Abraham. It opens with God's command to the first Hebrew, Lech Lecha, go forth from your native land and your father's house to the land that I will show you. We were actually introduced to our patriarch in the closing verses of last week's parashah through the story of Terach, Abraham's father. Listen to how last week's Sidra concludes. Terach took his son Abram, and they set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans for the land of Canaan. But when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there, and Terach died in Haran. So we learn that a generation before Abraham made his journey to Canaan, Terach had tried to get there too. He too had left his home, Ur in modern-day Iraq. But for some reason, when Terach arrived at Haran in northern Syria, he paused and never continued on to what had been his destination. The rabbis wondered why Terach only made it halfway. And in their answer, they played on the meaning of the name of the place where he stopped, Haran, which means crossroads. Apparently at Haran, Terach got crossed up, waylaid. Whatever the vision he had for his future that inspired him to leave Ur, by the time he reached Haran, he had either forgotten it or it had lost its motivating power. So his journey ended there. Most of us are a lot more like Terach than we are Abraham. How many times have we set out to accomplish some goal, but come to a juncture where we got sidetracked, interrupted? It happens all the time. Some pressing need arises that demands our more immediate attention, or we run out of time or patience or desire. Sometimes we are able to return to the pursuit and reach the goal, sometimes not. Each year, the High Holy Days challenge us to set for ourselves new objectives for the year ahead, or to renew our quest of old ones, important ones. I will spend more time with my family and friends. I will not work so hard. I will try to mend strained relationships. I will be more patient, more forgiving. I will believe in myself. We all can fill in our own blank. 1 month ago, we embarked on the journey of 5782, impelled by honest intention and conviction. But now we have reached the Haran time of the year, when the realities of daily life encroach upon those aspirations. No doubt some of the same old comfortable habits have crept back into our routines, and we've begun to find ourselves a bit off course. And if we don't recommit ourselves to the promises we just made, we will, like Terach, wind up settling in Haran. And those I wills will get harder and harder to fulfill, eventually becoming I'll tries, and then I wish I coulds, and finally, I can'ts. But we should be fair to ourselves too, realistic in our expectations. We're talking about difficult spiritual work, changing our behaviors and improving our relationships. We can't expect immediate results, either from ourselves or from others. Old habits are hard to break, and every now and again we fall back into them. That's not a sign of failure, just a symptom of the same human frailties we all share. And when those with whom we are seeking to repair rifts don't respond precisely as we had hoped, or are more tentative in reaching back than we were in reaching out, that's not a cue to give up either. Trust takes time to rebuild, but it can be rebuilt. We need to maintain the patience and the determination and the faith that our efforts will bear fruit, even if we can't yet see it. And this is the essential difference between Terach and Abraham, and why Terach couldn't go on. Remember, Terach was an idolater. He believed only in what he could see. Abraham was able to believe in what he could not, both a God he could not see and a future he could not know. That is the only real explanation for his answer to God's call with which this week's parashah begins. Why, when God said to Abram, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you," Abram went forth as God commanded him. He asked no questions. He didn't know where this promised land was, but he went anyway. And later on in the Sidra, when given the opportunity of settling elsewhere as his father had in the fertile Jordan River Valley, he claimed for himself instead the barren Judean desert because he believed that was where the future of his people would unfold. He chose the harder road, the path of faith, because he believed the effort would be worth the reward. The passage concludes, Abram took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived in the land of Canaan. Why is it necessary for the Bible to say, and they arrived in the land of Canaan, when we knew that's where they were headed? Because, clearly, setting out for a destination and actually reaching it are two different things. But as we learn from the tale of Rabbi Baruch, once we've embarked on the journey, we must allow ourselves the vulnerability and find within ourselves the faith and courage to continue. We owe it to ourselves. In this new year recently begun, may our personal goals be worthy of our efforts, the goals of patience and kindness. And may we be patient and kind with ourselves and with others if we don't reach them right away. And finally, may we believe enough in their value to continue their pursuit.